There's long been rumors as to how exactly rainbows are made in Equestria. While a great amount of Pegasi pony are employed in the rainbow department of the weather factory, almost all of them do the low-end work. What's known is that great streams of spectra, the individual colors of the rainbow, flow through large grates and into vast vats. From there, workers carefully and equally mix the spectra into the coagulated rainbow pools that dot and run through the factory and surrounding city. Next, that mixture is pumped to the floor below, where other employees atomize it and store it until the active weather Pegasi deploy it in the field. However, no one knows how individual spectra is made. Supplies are never seen being brought in, leaving not even a single clue as to what goes into a rainbow. Tourists, when visiting the factory, are treated to an extremely foreboding and plain wall, with massive, solid doors barring entry to any pony at any time. While most of the facility's various signs and architecture is bubbly and welcoming, the Rainbow Factory's upper floor is protected by harsh imagery of potentially hazardous material and death. And the cloud wall was made not out of the clean white of the rest of the city, but of a black, quietly thundering fog. To become an employee of the Upper Rainbow Factory meant sacrificing any life outside of those black walls. Workers are sworn to secrecy and forbidden from leaving, and live inside the factory itself. Those few who ever manage to make it out, not in a body bag, are twisted and disturbed, too damaged to even bring themselves to talk about it. A lot of theories were proposed. Dark magic from captured unicorns, chemicals and environmental hazards that no sane pony would tolerate, and even thoughts of another unknown sister of Celestia's, designed to create the spectra instead of raising the sun or the moon. None of them could be further from the truth.
Come on, Orion! We're gonna be late for our final test!
Scootaloo called to a friend of hers. She was older now, in her last year of flight school. She, like all the other Pegasi in school, were terribly nervous about the final test. Those that passed were granted freedom into the world, to find their cutie marks if they haven't yet, and to become working ponies. Little is known, or at least little thought about, is what happens to the fillies that fail their test. While uncommon, 1 or 2 from every class generally just don't have it in them to perform the rigorous acts and maneuvers. Those that fail their tests were looked down upon in the worst of ways, shunned and hated. Cloudsdale has always bred a form of nationalism amongst its occupants. If you weren't the best, or didn't show potential of being the greatest, you weren't allowed to be part of the glorious collective. Scootaloo moved a little to the side as Orion, a tall, yet fairly skinny pony, settled next to her. He fluffed his light brown feathers and gave a worried attempt at a smile as he stared around at where he sat. They were sitting in the large, open waiting room, onlooking the Colosseum, with all the other graduating Pegasi. Just visible in the distance was the factory. Orion glanced at it and gulped.
What's the matter, Orion? You afraid of getting a dead-end job on the snow line?
Orion chuckled a bit, then closed his eyes and sighed.
No, it's just... I don't know. I don't think I can do this. What if I fail? What if I don't fail, but do just bad enough to still be disliked by everyone? I don't know if I can take being deported. Where do we even go, anyways?
Scootaloo gave Orion a friendly punch.
No one knows you don't. And we're not going to fail. Everyone here is going to be fine. I know I'll at least pass.
She laughed.
Thanks to the tips from Rainbow Dash, I'm sure to be fine.
Oh yeah, sure. That reassures me. That's actually just as, if not even more reassuring than the psychopathic hate every pony here seems to love to spread.
Quit panicking, Scaredy Wings.
Scootaloo replied.
The only one here that I think might even fail is that yellow pony with the dark green mane. She's the one who was out sick for that month, you know.
Oh yeah.
Orion remembered as he craned his head in the other pony's direction.
The one who had that bad case of hoof and wing. She looks pretty confident, though.
I suppose we'll see.
Scootaloo trailed, turning to look at the factory herself. It gave her chills, but not of fear, of pride.
I hope I get some cool active weather job. Can you imagine? Everyone in Ponyville or Philadelphia staring up at me going, "There goes Scootaloo, such an amazing flyer." And from Cloudsdale, there can be no doubt.
She smiled in excitement, forgetting her tension for the moment.
That would be something, I'll admit. Mind you, just coming from Cloudsdale, who wouldn't be in awe?
Exactly. Praise the flock.
Praise the flock!
Places, places, every pony.
A massive, buff Pegasi walked towards the entrance to the Colosseum.
We're going to do this by name. Your adjudicators are on the east side of the field. Do not, I repeat, do not fly too far west. If they lose sight of you for any reason, you'll be failed. Immediately. Take deep breaths. Stretch your wings one last time. The test will consist of 3 sections: weather clearing, agility, and finally recovery. Clear the clouds, fly through the hoops, and then fly to the marked elevation. Close your wings for at least 3 seconds. Any less, and you'll fail. But keep in mind, there's no extra points for extra seconds. Finally, recover before you hit the cloud floor. Understand? Any questions?
The instructor paused, and carefully glanced at every single pony in the room. Every pony's eyes were completely focused on him, and none were creased with confusion.
All right. Aurora Dawn, you're up first. Clear, fly, fall, complete.
The yellow pony nodded and walked quickly up the starting ramp with purpose. She stared at the watching judges, waited for a nod from all three, and then took off with powerful force. The ramp bounced slightly from the force of the takeoff. Every pony watched as Aurora quickly reached the starting altitude, and then began a direct and purposeful attack on the positioned clouds. With expert timing and intelligent angles, the sky was soon empty of any moisture. Scootaloo and Orion watched with open mouths as they watched the first testee pull fast and tight turns, expertly shooting dead center through each and every hoop. Finally, Aurora pulled herself up to the proper altitude, hovered, and closed her wings. The group of students gasped as she started plummeting down towards the clouds, and counted breathlessly. 1, 2, 3. They sighed as they watched her wings open in the correct amount of time, collectively holding that relief. Suddenly, Aurora's wings whipped upwards, and the group of students flinched in horror as they all heard the loud, hollow snap, only to be suddenly replaced by an unending, piercing scream. Many, like Orion, shielded their eyes with their wings, as others, like Scootaloo, could only watch, terrified, as the blur of yellow, green, and red plummeted into a cloud with a dull thump. Wasting no time, the instructor walked forwards again as the 3 judges simply pointed down and started shuffling papers around. Speaking loudly, as if nothing had happened, he called out again.
Daisy Fields, clear, fly, fall, complete.
Scootaloo and Orion stared, slack-jawed, as another pony gulped and then walked forward onto the path and took off. They turned back to the tuft on the cloud where Aurora landed and stared. As the wind blew the fragments that were thrown up from the collision away, they saw the shivering, yellow body attempt to move, only to collapse with a cry.
Faraday spots. Clear, fly, fall, complete.
Aurora still struggled to walk, wailing with each step. Her legs weren't broken. She could use them just fine. But it was obvious. The pain from her wing joints and loss of her potential life was crushing her. Scootaloo felt Orion shuffle uneasily, tears welling in his eyes, as a frown formed on his face.
Holiday shine. Clear, fly, fall, complete.
No one's coming to help her.
Orion seethed through closed teeth. Scootaloo felt extremely sad for the yellow Pegasus, but couldn't see herself helping her. She would be failed herself and sent away, far away from Cloudsdale and any familiar place on Equestria, to a place where she and any other failed students could never stain Cloudsdale's reputation. It was a terrible shame, but Scootaloo couldn't fail herself. She couldn't fail her friends, and she definitely could not fail Rainbow Dash. Not after all the care and help that she'd given to Scootaloo her whole life. Scootaloo blinked back the tears from her eyes and forced herself to watch the competing students. One after another, they took off, successfully passed the test, and flew to the east gate, under the judge's spot in the stands. That's all that Scootaloo focused on. Pass the test, fly to the gate, and live a happy life.
Orion solstice. Clear, fly, fall, complete.
No.
What?
The instructor took a step back, one leg left raised in the air.
You can't just refuse your flight test. Get out of here before you tick off the judges.
No. Don't even pretend you care about my future if you don't care about hers.
Orion defied, unsure about himself.
You say you want me to get a good life, and yet you let those that fail suffer unbearable pain.
Get the heck onto the field before I fail you myself.
The instructor shouted menacingly.
Fine.
Orion spoke sharply before walking onto the ramp. He waited for their individual nods, and then the second that they came, he took off. However, long before the starting altitude, he turned sharply and landed gently next to Aurora. She turned and looked at him, blood running down her forehead and sides, and tears streaming down her face.
What are you doing? You'll fail like me. You'll be exiled.
I'd rather be exiled from a place that treats ponies like this than live my whole life while others don't live theirs.
Aurora smiled, happiness briefly replacing the sadness in her blackened, puffy eyes, until she stumbled again and intense pain flashed across her body. Orion leaned in close, using his wing to brace the yellow pony against himself. He stared up at the judges, beaming hate at them with his vision. They stared down, unaffected, and simply pointed down, before looking back towards the ramp for the next contestant. Scootaloo stood shocked, hardly even hearing her name called. She moved numbly up the ramp, never taking her eyes off of her friend and the pony who sacrificed himself to help. After a brief moment, she shook her head, recovered her thoughts, and looked to the judges. Thoughts passed through her head as she watched them all nod. Oh, Celestia, what do I do? I can't let everyone that I know down. But I'll never see Orion again. I suppose... I hope he knew that risk when he did that. I'm sure he's thinking the same thing right now. She glanced down at Orion. He wasn't looking at her. She took off, heartbroken. Instinct kicked in as the familiar rush of wind cooled her and blew her thoughts away. She stopped at the right altitude and then launched again, sensing and seeing every cloud, formulating a game plan. In a matter of a couple dozen seconds, the sky was clear. She did a quick loop in mid-flight, aiming at the first hoop. With a powerful flash of her wings, she propelled forward, through the first ring, and the second, and the third, expertly turning and drifting. She curved in towards the second to last ring, near the bottom of the field. As she descended, she caught sight of Orion and Aurora, almost at the west gate now. Orion turned his head and smiled weakly. Scootaloo's focus shattered. Orion knew what he did. He cared about her. He'd miss her. And he'd never get to say goodbye. Scootaloo cranked into the bottom part of the ring, falling backwards several feet and hitting the ground. With a sudden, intense flash of fear, she flipped herself onto her feet and began flapping her wings, levitating off of the ground. Maybe that didn't count as a failure, she thought. I can still fly. There was a distraction in the field. She spun around to the judges. 3 hooves, pointing down. Scootaloo started crying right there, tears welling up and blurring her vision. This wasn't right. This shouldn't have happened. None of it. Orion should have passed his test and cheered her on from the east gate. She shouldn't have looked at him. She should have focused on flying. But there was no room for excuses. Defeated, she slowly hovered towards Orion and settled down next to him. She looked at him with her purple eyes. He looked back, offering a smile.
You did a good job.
Scootaloo dropped her head and sobbed. She then walked around Orion, lifted a wing of her own, and helped Aurora walk to the west gate. Before them stood a long, unlit hall, with only a cheap sign stuck to the wall, notifying test failees to proceed down the hall. They waited, only briefly, to gather themselves and prepared for where they would be taken. And then they all stepped forward together.